Story 1. The Memory of the Night. The rain pounded relentlessly against the windshield, each drop a tiny hammer striking glass. The wipers screeched in protest, barely managing to push aside the heavy sheets of water. The road stretched before me, dark, empty, endless. The flickering streetlights cast weak halos in the thick fog, making everything feel surreal. My shift was almost over, just one last stretch before home. I longed for the comfort of my apartment, dry clothes, and the hum of my heater. But then I saw her. A woman stood on the roadside, barely visible through the storm. Her soaked dress clung to her frame, and her long, dark hair hung in dripping strands. She raised a hand slowly, a silent plea for help. My instincts screamed at me. Picking up a lone traveler this late on a deserted road, a terrible idea. But those eyes, hollow, pleading. Something inside me twisted. Before I fully registered the decision, I pulled over. She slid into the back seat, moving like a shadow. "Where to?" I asked, forcing casualness into my voice. "Just drive." Her whisper barely rose above the rain. A chill crawled up my spine, but I obeyed. The road seemed longer than before, winding through the fog like an uncoiling serpent. Minutes stretched, weighed down by silence. I adjusted the rearview mirror, sneaking a glance at her. She sat rigid, hands in her lap, staring blankly out the window. Rain blurred the view outside, but she watched it as though searching for something. Or someone. Trying to break the eerie quiet, I cleared my throat. "Rough night?" No response. She tilted her head slightly, gaze still fixed on the window. Her breath fogged the glass, forming shapes I couldn't quite decipher. Then, she whispered, "You don't remember, do you?" A strange pressure built in my chest. My hands clenched the wheel. "Remember what?" She finally looked at me through the mirror, and something about her felt familiar. My breath hitched. The fog outside thickened, swirling unnaturally. The headlights barely cut through the darkness now, swallowed whole by something deeper than night. "Who are you?" My voice came out hoarse. She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled. Not a normal smile. It was too wide, too wrong. "You should have stopped that night." Her voice was softer than before, but the words sliced through me. Pain shot through my skull. A memory, faint, buried, resisting, began to surface. The storm. The wet road. The neon glow of my dashboard clock reading 1:34 a.m. I was driving fast. Too fast. I had been out with friends, celebrating the end of a miserable work week. The rain had started while I was on the highway, and I remember being frustrated. I hated driving in storms. The roads were slick, and my tires struggled for grip. But I just wanted to get home. Then she appeared. A figure in the middle of the road. It happened too fast. A pale face, wide, terrified eyes staring at my approaching headlights. A flash of white, maybe a dress. Hands raised, a desperate attempt to stop me. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded. The steering wheel wrenched under my grip. But it was too late. The sickening impact sent a violent tremor through the car. The sound, God! That sound. Bone against metal, the body rolling over the hood, hitting the windshield with a crack before disappearing. Panic seized me. My pulse pounded in my ears. My breath came in short gasps. I should have stopped. I should have gotten out. But I didn't. Fear gripped me. The thought of what I'd done, of what I might see if I looked, was too much. My shaking hands clenched the wheel. My foot pressed hard on the gas. I drove away, leaving her behind. The realization struck like a hammer to the chest. I gasped, my grip on the wheel tightening. My pulse pounded against my skull. No, that's not. The mirror reflected an empty back seat, but her whisper came from right beside me. "You left me." I slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching against the wet pavement. The world spun, headlights flashing in the dark. The wheel wrenched from my grasp as the car fishtailed. Then, impact. Glass shattered. My body lurched forward. Metal twisted and groaned as the car flipped. The world became a blur of motion and sound. Then, stillness. For a long moment, I felt nothing. Then pain. Aching, crushing pain. Smoke curled from the wreckage. The scent of burnt rubber and blood filled the air. Rain pattered against my face as I lay, broken, among the remains of my car. Then I saw her, standing just beyond the wreckage, watching, not broken anymore. No blood, no pain, just waiting. Tears blurred my vision. I didn't mean to. I was scared. She stepped closer. I flinched, bracing for the worst. But instead of rage, there was something else in her expression. Understanding. "It's over," she whispered. The weight in my chest, one I hadn't even realized I carried, lifted. The suffocating guilt, the nightmares, the endless feeling of being watched, all of it vanished. For the first time in years, the road was empty. The flashing lights of an approaching ambulance cut through the darkness. My body ached, my breath shallow, but I knew one thing: she was never after revenge. She just wanted me to remember. And now that I did, she could finally rest. Story 2. The Empty Bed in Room 306. Caleb was excited about his new hostel room, Room 306. Rue is 6. It was spacious, with large windows that overlooked the campus, and the walls were adorned with the typical worn-out posters. His roommates, Aaron and Victor, were friendly enough, which made him feel comfortable despite the usual awkwardness of moving into a new place. The first few days passed without incident. The three of them settled into a rhythm, studying, eating, and chatting late into the night. But there was one thing that gnawed at Caleb, something he couldn't shake off. The room had 4 beds. 3 of them were occupied: Caleb, Aaron, and Victor. But the 4th bed, the one by the window, remained untouched. The sheets were always perfectly made, the pillow never disturbed, and Caleb assumed that a 4th roommate would be arriving soon. Curious, Caleb asked one evening, "So, who's our 4th roommate?" Aaron and Victor exchanged a quick glance. The silence that followed made Caleb uncomfortable. "No one," Victor muttered. "What do you mean?" Caleb asked, confused. Aaron sighed, glancing at the empty bed. That bed, no one sleeps there. At first, Caleb thought it was some kind of inside joke. Maybe they were playing with him. But the unsettling feeling didn't fade. That night, as Caleb lay in bed, he couldn't shake the strange sensation that something wasn't right. He glanced over at the 4th bed. The sheets, which had been smooth when he went to sleep, were now slightly creased. The pillow appeared slightly shifted. Had someone been in that bed? He couldn't explain why, but a cold shiver ran down his spine. At first, the disturbances were subtle, a soft rustling sound in the middle of the night. Caleb awoke, thinking it was Aaron or Victor shifting in their sleep. But when he turned over, he saw both of them lying perfectly still, their breathing steady. The rustling continued. It came from the empty bed. Caleb squinted through the darkness, trying to make sense of it. He could barely see, but something was definitely moving. The sheets, slightly wrinkled as if someone was tossing and turning. A strange chill filled the room. Then, a whisper. It was low and indecipherable. Words that didn't sound like any language Caleb recognized. The voice was muffled, breathy, like someone reciting a prayer backward. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat. He flicked on the bedside lamp. The whispering stopped. Aaron and Victor jolted awake, their eyes wide with alarm. "You heard that?" Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. Aaron nodded slowly. "It happens every night." Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. He stared at the empty bed, heart racing. Who was the last 4th roommate? Victor's face darkened, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't talk about that." The next morning, Caleb couldn't ignore the unease in his chest. He went straight to the hostel warden, his words tumbling out in a rush. "There's something wrong with my room," he blurted. "The 4th bed, someone's been using it." The warden froze. His expression changed, his face paling slightly. "What room number?" he asked, voice strained. 306, Caleb replied, his pulse quickening. The warden rubbed his temples, then met Caleb's gaze. He seemed to hesitate, as if weighing whether or not to say anything further. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That bed belonged to a student. Last semester. His name was Dean." Caleb's heart skipped. "What happened to him?" The warden glanced down, his hands trembling slightly. "He died. In a very tragic accident. He was found on campus near the woods." Caleb's confusion deepened. "An accident?" The warden nodded. "Yes, but it wasn't just any accident. He fell, hit his head on a rock. The impact was so severe, they said it killed him instantly." Caleb felt the unease tighten in his stomach. "That's terrible. But why is the bed still here? Why does it feel like someone's been sleeping there?" The warden looked uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, taking a long breath before continuing. "Dean didn't just die in an accident, Caleb. Before that, he had been acting strange, paranoid, distant. He said he was hearing voices. People thought it was just stress, but the night before the accident, he kept muttering about needing to join them." Caleb frowned, a chill creeping up his spine. "Join who?" The warden's eyes darkened. Some say he wasn't just hearing things. They say something evil was after him. And the night of his death, he was found near the woods, alone, his body gone, disappeared. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat dry. You mean his body? The warden nodded gravely. Yes. They never found him. The police searched, but there was no trace. Some think Dean, he was taken, and that the room, the bed, is cursed. It's still waiting for someone else to take his place. Caleb's stomach dropped. So the fourth bed, it's not just empty, it's haunted? The warden closed his eyes, nodding slowly. We don't speak of it, Caleb, but if you sleep in that bed, you might become part of the cycle. You might just vanish like he did. That night, Caleb lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what the warden had told him. But the whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. The bed creaked. Caleb's heart raced. He opened his eyes and glanced toward the fourth bed. The sheets were moving again, rustling as if someone was there, tossing and turning. But Caleb didn't want to look. He forced himself to stay still, trying to block out the growing noise in his head. But then he saw it. A shadowy figure, hunched over, sitting on the fourth bed. Its breathing was deep, ragged, as if struggling to take in air. Aaron, Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. Victor. But neither of them moved. They were still asleep. Caleb's blood ran cold. He reached for his phone, turned on the flashlight. The figure was gone. The bed was empty. His heart stopped. He turned to Aaron's bed and froze. Aaron was gone. His bed was empty. His blanket lay crumpled on the floor, but Aaron was nowhere to be found. The whispering grew louder, and Caleb could feel the walls closing in on him. In the silence that followed, Caleb's mind raced. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then he saw it. The fourth bed. For the first time, it wasn't empty. A figure lay under the sheets, its back turned toward them. Victor gasped in horror. Is that Aaron? Caleb stepped forward, trembling. He reached for the blanket. The figure turned. It wasn't Aaron. It was someone else. Pale, with sunken eyes, its skin was gray, decaying. The lips twisted into a grotesque grin. Caleb stumbled backward, terror gripping him. The figure sat up slowly and whispered in a voice that sounded as old as the room itself, Now, we're four. The door slammed shut, and room 306 had a new fourth roommate. The next day, the hostel was quiet. The warden never saw Caleb or Victor again. Aaron was never found. Room 306 remained locked, the fourth bed always made, waiting for the next to join the cycle. Story 3. The Silent Patient of Room 409. Daniel never liked hospitals. The cold air, the dim corridors, the distant sounds of medical machines, it all felt unsettling. But after fracturing his leg in a minor accident, he had no choice but to spend the night in room 409 at St. Augustine Hospital. It was a private room at the far end of the hallway. The nurse assured him it was quiet and comfortable. But as soon as Daniel was wheeled inside, something felt wrong. The air was too cold. The window blinds trembled, even though there was no wind. The fluorescent light overhead flickered just once, quick and sharp, like a warning. Daniel shook it off. It was just an old hospital, nothing more. He settled into bed, scrolling through his phone to pass the time. Then it started. At 3:09 a.m., the room changed. The air grew dense, pressing against his chest. His phone screen flickered, then turned off completely, even though it had plenty of charge. Then came the first sound, a low, distant knock. Not from the door, not from the walls, from inside the bathroom. Daniel froze. He had been awake the whole time. No one had gone in. Another knock. Louder. The bathroom door shuddered slightly as if something had pressed against it from the inside. Daniel's fingers trembled as he reached for the call button to summon a nurse. Crack! The bathroom light snapped on by itself. The door, locked just moments ago, slowly creaked open. Inside, the mirror was fogged over as if someone had just been breathing against it. But the bathroom was empty. Daniel swallowed hard, his pulse racing. He pressed the nurse call button repeatedly. Nothing. The monitor beside his bed suddenly let out a sharp, garbled beep, distorting as if the machine itself was gasping for air. Then, a sound from the ceiling. A faint, scraping noise. Not a rat, not the air vents. It was slow. Something was moving above him. Daniel clenched the bedsheet, heart pounding. He didn't want to look up. He just knew, that if he did, he'd see something he wasn't meant to see. The scraping stopped. Then, from the corner of his eye, a shadow moved. Not outside, inside the room. Daniel turned his head just in time to see it. A tall, thin figure standing at the foot of his bed. No face, no features, just a hollow, stretched out shape, completely still. Then the lights flickered violently, and in the brief flashes of darkness, the figure moved. First to the side of his bed, then near the door, then inches from his face. Daniel didn't breathe. He couldn't. The air was filled with a deep guttural sound. Not a whisper, not a voice, just breathing, ragged, sharp, right next to his ear. Then everything stopped. The lights returned to normal. The room was still. The bathroom door was closed again, and the figure was gone. The nurse finally entered, finding Daniel drenched in sweat, gripping his sheets like a lifeline. "You look pale," she said. "Bad dream?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "No." The nurse gave him a small smile. "Don't worry. This room just feels creepy at night. There's a story about it, actually." Daniel swallowed hard. "What story?" She adjusted his IV drip. "Years ago, this room belonged to a coma patient. The doctors said he was completely brain dead, but nurses would hear sounds coming from inside, scraping noises, shuffling, breathing." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. The nurse sighed. "One night, the sounds stopped. The next morning, the patient was gone." Daniel tensed. "You mean he died?" The nurse shook her head. "No." She gave him a serious look. "He just disappeared." She patted his arm and walked out, leaving Daniel alone again. He turned slowly toward the bathroom. The light was off. The mirror was still fogged, but this time there was a single wet handprint on the glass, as if someone had just been standing there, waiting. Daniel's breathing was shallow. His eyes stayed locked on the wet handprint on the bathroom mirror. He hadn't moved. No one had gone in. Then, right before his eyes, the handprint started to fade. Not like condensation evaporating, like something had wiped it away. Daniel's hands clenched the sheets. His heart pounded against his ribs, but he forced himself to stay still. He couldn't show fear. Whatever was in this room, it wanted him to react. The clock on the wall ticked softly, 3:19 a.m. He just had to make it until morning, but then a new sound. Not from the bathroom this time, from under his bed. It started as a soft, slow scraping against the tiles, like fingernails dragging across the floor. Daniel's pulse skyrocketed. His body screamed at him not to look, but his curiosity won. He leaned over the edge of his bed and saw nothing, just the empty, dark space beneath. He let out a shaky breath and pulled back. Then he heard the deep inhale, right next to his ear. A burst of icy air brushed against his skin as if someone had just exhaled against his neck. Daniel bolted upright. The room was empty. The air was thick with something unseen, watching. He fumbled for the call button again, pressing it repeatedly. Still no response. Then his blanket tightened around him. Not just tightened. Pulled. Slowly. As if invisible fingers were curling into the fabric, dragging it toward the foot of the bed. Daniel yanked it back, his breath caught in his throat. The bed frame creaked. The temperature dropped further. Then, for the first time since the nightmare began, the door handle moved, not violently, not slammed, turned, slowly, deliberately. Daniel's mouth went dry. The door should have been locked. It wasn't anymore. Click. The handle stopped turning. The door creaked open, just an inch. Enough to see the hallway. Enough to see a shape standing outside. Tall. Motionless. A silhouette of something thin and stretched, like it didn't quite belong in human skin. Daniel's blood ran cold. His instincts screamed at him to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen. But then the figure moved. Not stepped. Shifted. Jerked. 1 second, it was in the doorway. The next, it was closer, just inside the room. Daniel's fingers dug into the sheets. His throat was too dry to scream. Then the power cut out. The room plunged into darkness. The machine stopped beeping. The soft hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights in the hallway died. Silence. Daniel couldn't see anything, but he felt it. Standing right in front of his bed. Not breathing. Not moving. Just waiting. Then a sound cut through the darkness. A sharp metallic clang, like hospital instruments being dropped. Then footsteps. Fast ones. Running. And a voice, distant but sharp. "Daniel?" Suddenly, the power came back. The overhead lights flooded the room with their harsh fluorescent glow. Daniel gasped, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His wide eyes scanned the room. The figure was gone. The blanket was normal. The door was shut. And standing in the doorway was a doctor, staring at him with concern. "Are you okay?" the doctor asked. Daniel couldn't speak. He just nodded slowly. The doctor sighed and stepped inside. "I saw your call light flashing on the monitor, but the power..." He shook his head. "Something weird happened with the power." Daniel swallowed. Did anyone come in?" The doctor frowned. "No, the night staff was dealing with the power outage." "Why?" Daniel's gaze flickered to the bathroom. The mirror was clear now, no fog, no handprint, but the air still felt heavy. "Wrong." The doctor checked his chart. "Well, you're being discharged in the morning. Should be good news, right?" Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the door because, as the doctor spoke, he saw it. The door handle, slowly twisting, as if something was still outside, waiting for next time. The end. Or is it? Room 409 remained occupied. Patients came and went, but every now and then, a nurse would find the mirror fogged up and a single wet handprint. Until next time, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and don't forget to subscribe. You never know what's hiding in the dark.